just when you thought that bad ideas couldn't get any worse, bad ideas get worse. So you probably remember my Modern Warfare 2 3D printed Glock slide video, sort of making fun of the video game and the people who thought that had been possible. Of course, people thought that printing a Glock slide just straight up printed would work for much longer than Modern Warfare 2, which is probably why the developers of Modern Warfare 2 put one in a game, even though we learned earlier it doesn't work. Following that video, I had pretty much dismissed the idea of like a do-it-yourself or Glock slide even being a possibility. Just forget it, right? And I was actually in a Discord call, and my good buddy Boostwillis popped in. Boostwillis has been involved in the 3D printed gun community, for quite some time, has come up with like a P90 style 12 gauge mag, all sorts of awesome different stuff, but has been messing around with plate stack bolts and those sorts of things for a while now. And he shows me a concept idea for a Glock slide that's got, you know, a back plate that's steel, and then breech plate that's steel, and a hood plate that's steel, and a front plate that's steel. And he starts explaining this, and I'm like, well, this is why it won't work, because of this reason and that reason and that reason. And we sort of go back and forth, like, you know, each like throwing up, you know, flack for each other's ideas, and then shooting them down, and then finding solutions and ways around it. And we sort of settled at this sort of design. Obviously, very rough prototype. Haven't shot it yet. Learned so many things through the hazards of this assembly, but figured I'd go ahead and put another video together because this is, I guess, maybe novel. If not novel, the stupidity is interesting, right? So the breech plates, or all of the metal plates, rather, were fabricated by Sind, which is a laser cutting company. You send them 2D files, they will send you laser cut metal. The breech face itself is 4130. I figured it needed some sort of alloy steel because it's beating against the barrel constantly. Everything else is 304. Just because while it needs to be metal, it doesn't need to be terribly strong, at least by my estimate. And then, of course, threaded rod to hold the sole slide together, which gives it an interesting look. One note on the threaded rods is you can only fit 3 of them because, of course, you can't have a threaded rod through here because the ejection would be interesting. You'd need a top ejecting Glock. Of course, with a Gen 3 ejector, most Glocks are top ejecting, so maybe you could get away with it. That'd be funny. Anyway, the issue with the threaded rods that I sort of immediately ran into is as you tighten these down, it will bend the slide a ton because the printed sections want to bow out much more than I expected they would. So like if you just tighten the bottom 2, you have a slide that's sort of, you know, U-shaped or C-shaped, upside down C, upside down U. If you tighten just the ones on the left side a bunch, you have a Glock slide that is like visibly bent 3 or 4 degrees by the end of it. So getting the threaded rods all balanced out just right proved a little bit more difficult than I expected, but certainly possible. As far as, you know, predictions, right? It seemed everybody enjoyed predicting last time what would happen with the full printed slide. This one's going to be more interesting. So one thing I noticed right off the bat probably is a combination of, you know, the threaded rods sort of bowing the parts, as well as the fact that, like, obviously the slide is sort of hodgepodge together. Very first prototype here, even. The barrel latch seems to be sitting too low in the frame, and it prevents the barrel from coming up as high as like 100% straight in battery, you know, with the bore perfectly aligned with the striker hole. Currently the barrel sits a little bit lower, however it is fully engaged on the locking lug. If you're familiar with Glock internal geometry, you'll know it's kind of a fucking nightmare, because you've got your barrel latch there that the barrel locks into, and the barrel abuts the locking hood, but the breech face is what's actually pushing the slide into battery. It's an absolute mess. much more complex than on the Browning High Power, where like your locking block or cam pin just handles all of that, and your spring pushes directly on the barrel and the barrel pin, which is nice. So that's that's my soapbox moment. I think the High Power's locking geometry is a lot simpler, at least, than what they came up with for the Glock. And you know, the easy takedown is, of course, the benefit of that much more complex sort of lockup. So as a result of that, the barrel hood at the rear doesn't pop up all the way as high as it should. Probably the camera can't see it, but I'd made a mark about there on the breech face, which is where the barrel hood should come up to with everything perfectly aligned. You can force it into that position with a screwdriver, but it like pops into there, and it will sometimes pop out on its own, and that's just because, you know, that's the barrel, instead of sitting inside the notch on the takedown. I guess I could show you. exactly what I'm talking about here. The actually, I can't with this barrel because the way I designed this to work is instead of having a complex profile need to be ground into these front plates, I made them just have enough clearance for the barrel to do its tilting action, so you can't take the barrel out without undoing the threaded rods. I think that's a lot cleverer because it prevents you having to like grind a bunch on the 2D parts. But with this other barrel, what I'm talking about is there's a locking tab there on the front of the barrel that interfaces with the little takedown latch. And that takedown latch does the job of constraining how far forward the barrel can travel. But what I think is actually happening is like the lip on this lug is interfacing with the lip on there instead of the notches fitting together, and it's forcing the rear end of the barrel to sit lower than it ordinarily would. Because if you take, this is obviously a real slide, it's from JSD. If you put this slide on this frame, barrel's in perfect position the way it should be. If you put this slide on this frame, of course you have that issue. And I think that's just compounded from a couple of things. First off being, I had to custom headspace this slide. The plates from Send advertise that they're, to 3 decimal places precision. They're not, and that's just the nature of plate steel in general. It's going to vary by 1 or 2 thou. So there's a tolerance stack up that gets built in here, which I then had to mill like maybe 10 thou off of this locking hood. And the barrel does have a little bit of wiggle, but that is generally necessary. Right? Every Glock slide has some of that, unless you're dealing with match grade stuff. In which case it won't run steel case, blah blah blah. Don't need to get into that. So anyway, that discussion is mainly meant to point to the fact that this is an early prototype. There's definitely room for improvement on the fitment of this stuff. With these side plates being longer, you could headspace with these, which is really what's holding the headspace in place currently as it stands, as frightening as that may seem. But for all intents and purposes, it does cycle nice. You may notice I did omit the drop safety plunger, the trigger pull safety plunger, mostly because the geometry for that gets so thin in this printed area that I'd prefer this be as strong as possible. But of course did leave the extractor slot, because that is necessary for function. Trigger pull plunger is not. I have done primer tests with this, with this slide and frame. It will set off primers that aren't hard primer, but stuff with hard primers that won't set off just due to the fact that the barrel is like maybe 10 thou out of alignment with the striker hole, and that 10 thou of misalignment with the striker will cause light strikes on hard primers. But it does pop up consistently, and like I said, it is 100% engaged on the locking hood. If just if you can imagine, if like you can make the rear end of this slide a little bit lower and it's still fully engaged. Kind of hard to describe, but just has to do with the tolerance stack of where the barrel's constrained at the front, where the barrel's constrained at the hood, where the barrel's constrained by the latch, and where the barrel is pushed against by the breech face. That's why I think, wow, Glock slides have so much more complexity to them than you ever could have imagined. It will chamber rounds from a magazine. It passes all of the basic bench function tests, right? Just short of actually shooting the thing. But one more thing I did want to compare here is weight, which is probably the obvious question that you're asking. Is like, before on the test, weight didn't matter because the strength of the slide was going to be a much bigger issue than the weight of the slide, and we saw that it didn't even try to cycle, just blew the back half of it off. Now weight may actually be a concern. So you may be familiar with like competition Glock slides tend to get lighter as light as possible, but most of that's because they then run hand loads or factory ammo that's downloaded. Like it's 9mm 115 grain that's only going 800 foot per second. That's like 9mm minus P, and they'll do this for lighter recoil impulse, and so of course they use lighter slides. However, these slides can handle regular power 9mm. And this slide ends up being just slightly lighter than the lightest competition slides that I was able to find that they advertised can use normal ammo. They did say don't use plus P ammo in that slide though, so maybe we're on the ragged edge, but we'll learn. Let's see, we can take a regular slide and barrel weighing in at about 15 ounces. We're probably going to weigh half of that. Okay, 11.5. So we're missing like 4 ounces in the slide, which doesn't sound like much, but it may be significant. Another thing maybe to note, while I'm prattling off the stuff I've learned while putting this together, even with our 4130 breech face, the barrel does mar it up just a little bit. It is still smooth, but it drags. You can feel, every time the thing comes into battery, the barrel's smacking into the breech face. You can feel where that is. It's left a little bit of a dent. So from a standpoint of DIY ability, it may be a thing that you'd want to heat treat the breech face itself, but that would depend. And I have seen cheap aftermarket, like rock slide tier Glock slides, have this same issue where the breech face gets dented. So that's at least something to be aware of. I don't know that there's a ton more that I prattle about here. Put this back together. What I'm thinking for a test is probably, again, still in a vise, because I do not trust this. Predicting failures. Forgot to predict failures. What I think is going to happen is that the rear breech block assembly is going to crack. If you think about this from a forces perspective, you're going to have the cartridge fired. The cartridge case is going to push on the breech face. It's obviously not going to just collapse and crumple the whole breech face like it did before, because we have steel plates now. So it'll push on the first steel plate, which pushes on the second, which pushes on the third, which pushes on this plastic section. Given how flexible I saw this plastic was when I was tightening these threaded rods, I think that this breech section is going to want to bend, and it may bend enough that it cracks. I imagine this will actually fire 1 round successfully. No bets on if it'll extract and eject, but I bet it will fire 1 round without pieces flying everywhere. So that's sort of what remains to be seen. But given the fact that this now doesn't have a breech face that's going to crumple, and you'd have to break the threaded rod for the whole breech assembly to get blown off, I think that this will at least fire 1 round now, because we've solved the issues that we saw were problems before. On the note of the threaded rod, it is just a through hole. There is no threading into any of the printed parts. There is no threading into the metal parts. Of course, you could thread it into the metal parts, and that would actually make the metal parts significantly stronger. The issue, though, is you'd have to time your threads the whole way through, and that would be very difficult. If you had a threading jig, sure, it'd be possible, but you'd need a tap that's like that long, and I don't think they make those for number 8 machine screws. So as a result of that, no threading going on in internal components, and that's probably just the way it has to be. Maybe you could put a nut on either side of these and then cinch that nut down, but by that point you're getting even less meat in the plastic, and I think the meat in the plastic is going to end up being a limiting factor for us here. So that's sort of my prediction, and that crack may come up front once you think about it, from a standpoint of things bending, but I think it is going to be a crack in the plastic. Maybe the other easy prediction to make is the rails on the slide will crack. I haven't thickened any of these up beyond factory spec. I did print all the printed parts vertical though, so these rail tabs on the slide have as much strength as they possibly could have, but that's not saying much because it's a very thin web of PLA. And maybe one other thing to note is I did make the slide taller and wider on both sides than a standard Glock slide in order to get sufficient edge distance for the threaded rods themselves. Now, with all that discussed, I think we are just about ready to go outside where it is freezing cold and shoot this stupid thing. Alright, so more or less the same test setup as before. We got our slide, frame held in a vise, got multiple rounds in the magazine. I'll just rack one in there, make sure it's in battery. While I was on my way over here, I decided I'm actually going to take cover behind my four-wheeler, because if things do go sideways, metal parts could go multiple directions, specifically the extractor, which is of course aimed at the camera, but I'm concerned that the extractor, because it's only held in by plastic, might try and go funny directions. So for that reason, I've decided behind the four-wheeler is the spot for me. So, without much more need for discussion, make sure we're in battery, pointing in this safe direction. I'm going to go find my way behind the four-wheeler, and we'll like this.
Make sure the string's on the trigger just right. We'll see what happens.
Had some trouble getting the string straightened out there. Let's see what we did. Gun obviously moved in the vise. Looks like it fired. I don't think it cycled. That's a live round. It did cycle. I don't know what that means for us, but I'm going to inspect the slide up close to our cracks, and then we'll see what we do from there, but seems like it's in one piece. So upon looking at the slide, I can't see any obvious cracks. The slide isn't, cracked off the frame yet, so the only responsible thing to do is try it again. Make sure we're on the trigger. Probably should just tape the string to the trigger at this point, but well, that cycled as well. Camera's way over here. I got it zoomed in. Seems like it's all right. I'll pause the camera, get a new angle set up so you guys can look close at the slide. Well, here's our slide. No visible cracks anywhere that I have noticed, at least not yet. Moves free. Trigger pull feels the exact same. I mean, it seems like it's doing pretty darn good. Take a look at the breech face here. Camera may have a hard time focusing on it. I guess the camera's gonna have a real hard time with that with the angle the sun's at. Maybe we could... You can at least see part of the breech face. So far as I can tell, there's no damage or deformation whatsoever, which is giving me bad ideas, like I need to shoot this by hand. So my two hands had a rock, paper, scissors war. The right hand lost, so it gets to go ahead and try this. See if we can get ourselves good camera angle. No sight, so I'm just going to send it. It kicks a lot more than a normal Glock, probably as a result of that slide being light. But I mean, that's 3 shots now, 1 by hand, and looks to me like it's holding up fine. Alright, so we got our slide. I'm going to try another round, but what I'm going to do is hold it off to the side again with my right hand. I'm not comfortable with my face behind the slide, certainly not yet. I have tightness checked all the screws. They're as tight as they were, so there's been no compression or bending in the slide so far as I can tell. Screws haven't come loose. And while these are locking screws, I had them on and off so many times getting everything in the slide assembled straight. Some of them are just screws at this point, because of course, the nylon locking inserts only last 1 or 2 installations. But what I want to do is watch where the ejected case goes, because I want to see if there's any signs of weirdness on a fired case. So, go ahead and get ourselves lined up. Oh, maybe a light strike? So it's doing that thing where it doesn't, it's not quite humping into battery 100%. Let's try that same round again. But I'll give it a punch to make sure it's in battery. Refocus the camera here. That's as in battery as I can get it without forcing it. I have no idea where that case went. I mean, it disappeared. We'll try one more. I saw it. So there's our fired case. You can see 2 distinct, maybe you can if this stupid camera will focus. See just 2 distinct marks on it. One being when it was first, for the first strike there, and the second one when I smushed it. And again, that's just the difference of the barrel's not quite locking against the locking plate quite right. But, I mean, this thing's working much better than I expected. Oh, I take that back. look what we got here. The printed section here is bulged. Right there is now sticking up well flush of the little metal plates. Yeah, you can see that, I think. Yeah, look at that. That's not right. I don't know when that showed up, but I think it was just this most recent shot. Ooh, now the slide doesn't want to come off the frame. Let me get my hammer. Try there we go. Check out our frame. It looks okay. Yeah, I don't see anything alarming there. But obviously something happened in here. Okay, I see what it is. So of course, when the gun fires, the cartridge pushes on these plates, which pushes on the plastic part, which pushes on the rear steel plate, which pushes on the nuts on the threaded rod, which pulls the back part of the slide forward. Of course, all of the momentum, as it were, of the front half of the slide is concentrated on the hood plates, and they're also pulling the barrel back against blow forward forces and against the barrel's own momentum. So what it looks like happened here is these hood plates were pushing on the front part of the slide, and they've just bulged it out. Because you've got a little bit of weight concentrated here, a little bit of stress concentrated. So this is bulged up and over, and then underneath, it's also bulged over. So, of course, the internal stress that the threaded rods put on the printed parts is already compressing them. And then when firing, that's now additional compressive force. The momentum of the barrel, the blow forward forces, and the weight of the front of the slide as it's getting pulled backwards seems to have just made this thin plastic wall go bleh against the hood plates. I already have ideas on how that would be remedied. But as I'm looking at things here, that might not matter because the hood plate here, where the barrel locks into, has smushed. It's smeared. Not much, maybe only 1/1000th of an inch. But where the barrel's locking against has also moved. So you're losing, I guess you're technically gaining headspace, but you've lost headspace as a result of these hood plates squishing. So the hood plates would probably need to be harder steel. The breech face still looks good. No signs of it, trying to cave in or dish or crater. Probably go back inside to the workbench and talk about some of this more, but yeah, I've got ideas on how you'd limit this happening, limit this bulging happening. Essentially just build the printed part of the slide up over the top here. Have it wrap around so it'd be less likely to try and bulge over, because if it's stiffer in the area it's bulging, you'd prevent that. Sort of put a flange or a ridge on this area where it's yielded. But the hood plate here, having the indentation of the barrel hood, that's not good. You don't want that, because that's it's a change in headspace. So potentially that hood plate is going to have to be 4130, like the breech face, or some other solution will be required there. I mean, yeah, you can feel this thing's got more wiggle in it now than before. But yeah, I guess all things considered, though, I'm going to call that something of a success. Go back inside, do a little debrief, and then send you guys on your way. Alright, a real quick recap now that we are back inside. Don't have the tripod just because I'm going to show this off real quick and give my closing thoughts. So, you may be able to see there, if it'll focus, sort of, yeah, there you can see the shadow of it, where the barrel hood was indenting into the metal. This would need to be a harder piece of metal or heat treated or something if this was meant to be something more than like the less than 10 rounds we got out of it today. So certainly one major place for improvement there, and that would require getting new plates made. As well as I was looking at this plate to me looks bent here. And when I hold up something square to it, it does sort of confirm my theory that these plates bent, and that's why the plastic actually buckled. So certainly a harder, more rigid steel is ended up needed here. As you can see, these plates bent. And that's actually kind of surprising that that would happen there, but then not back at the breech face. Because at least as far as I'm concerned, the breech face seems like it would be getting slugged harder, because the front here is just dealing with momentum and blow forward forces, which sum total are going to be less than the forces ramming on the breech face. But sure enough, these plates bent. So potentially thicker or more numerous plates here would help. Although I guess, I did mention I headspaced this. I did cut about 10 thou out of it so it would headspace with the slide. Certainly that did weaken it, makes it easier for it to have bent up top there. So maybe room for consideration there. And whenever you do look at this cross-section of material, that's not terribly thick. It's small enough you could bend this in and out with pliers. So potentially you just need a taller plate here, a taller web connecting your two flanges, your two ears, if you will, on the sides. So room for improvement there, but almost certainly will require new metal plates to be cut. So I guess we're calling this part 1 or part 2 maybe of a series where we sort of mess around with the do-it-yourselfer-ish Glock slide. Of course, maybe this has implication and potential for stuff outside of just Glock slides, right? If you made a dedicated frame for this, you could simplify a lot of what goes on in here down to the point where the slide would be easier to do it yourself, because of course these rail notches would be kind of obnoxious to do it yourself without a laser or without a milling machine. But you could make those rail notches chunky and have them be on the printed parts only and not on the metal parts, and make them chunky enough that then they just interface with a slide that has reciprocally chunky rails, and potentially get yourself to like a more do-it-yourselfer suited thing. At least my opinion, my thoughts for now. I don't think that locked breech is friendly to do-it-yourselfer at all because of what we've seen here. Material hardness matters a lot anytime you have anything locking into anything, and heat treating on your own is fine if it's like, I want this to be as hard as possible, but that's not really what you want for an application like this, right? You're balancing hardness between the barrel itself and between the hood plates. And of course 304 stainless, which is what these are, isn't terribly soft. Probably just with 4130 it would be okay, which is what I'll try next, is having those made of 4130. But my wisdom as far as a fully do-it-yourselfer design is just avoid locked breech altogether. So potentially that'll be another thing that I'll cook up. And I know I've tossed this idea back and forth with Boostwillis, making the slide chunkier, making pockets for tungsten and or lead weights, which would be easy to do if you abandon Glock parts compatibility, and then just sort of like, again, do it yourself for the whole thing. So I think there is plenty of room for, that down the line. A straight blowback sort of high point, or VP90 or VP70. I don't know, whatever the German high point was. Sort of that style of a design. But at least for now, I'm more than happy to show this off. It did better than I expected. And I guess I was dead wrong in my prediction. The hood plates failed. The breech plates were fine. The plastic didn't really distend or bend. And I don't think this was a failure of the plastic. I think it was just the hood plates. I predicted it was the plastic, in compression failing, but I think it's just because the hood plates bent, and the hood plates bending pushed the plastic out. So, this has potential. Certainly can be improved, but it'll be an iteration over time. I hope it's been interesting to you guys, and perhaps another notch in the progress of, I don't know, if not do-it-yourself or Glock slides, is at least useful information for anybody who is pursuing a do-it-yourself or pistol design, which, down the road, maybe the direction this takes as I follow it. But of course, I've got so many other projects going. Don't hassle me or expect an update too soon on this. I'm sure it'll be weeks, if not months, before I really get back to it. I've got flangeless versions of a bunch of roller delay guns and all other sorts of stuff I'm working on. But I thought this was pretty interesting for what it is. Anyway, I'll catch you guys next time.